The hostess didn't even blink. That was what Claire Whitmore would remember most about that evening. Not the polished marble floors that caught the light like frozen water, not the low hum of a jazz quartet playing somewhere near the back of the room, not even the scent of truffle and aged wine that clung to the air like a quiet luxury. What she would remember was the way the woman behind the podium looked right through her, as though she were made of glass, as though she simply did not belong, and maybe to everyone in that restaurant she didn't. Claire had walked into Orem, one of the most exclusive dining establishments in Manhattan, wearing a pale blue dress she'd bought 3 years ago at a department store sale. It wasn't torn or dirty. It was clean, pressed even. But it was the kind of dress that whispered modest income in a room designed to shout old money. Her hair was swept back in a simple knot, and her shoes, though polished, had seen better days. She carried a small leather purse that had been a gift from her mother, worn at the corners and soft from years of use. She had taken a cab across town after finishing her shift at the community health clinic, where she volunteered 3 evenings a week. She was tired in the way that only truly good people get tired, not from laziness but from giving. Her feet ached, her back was stiff. But she'd made a reservation weeks ago for this particular Tuesday evening, and she intended to keep it. "Good evening," she said, smiling at the hostess, a tall woman in her early 30s with sharp cheekbones and an expression calibrated to communicate exclusivity. "I have a reservation. Whitmore, party of 1." The hostess, her name tag read Serena, tapped at the screen in front of her with one manicured finger, her expression never quite settling into warmth. She looked. She looked again. Then she looked up at Claire with the kind of measured politeness that was worse somehow than open contempt. "I'm sorry," Serena said, though she didn't sound it. "I'm not seeing your reservation in our system." "It should be there," Claire said. "I made it online about 3 weeks ago. I have the confirmation email on my phone." She reached into her purse and produced the phone, an older model, its screen slightly cracked at one corner, and found the email. She turned it toward Serena, who glanced at it with the same detached efficiency a customs agent might give a questionable passport. "Unfortunately," Serena said, "our system doesn't reflect this booking. It may have been a third-party error. We're fully committed this evening, and I'm afraid we won't be able to accommodate walk-ins." Claire kept her smile in place, though it cost her something. "I understand there might be a technical issue, but I do have proof of the reservation. Is there a manager I could speak with?" The pause that followed was barely a second long, but Claire felt every millisecond of it. "Of course," Serena said. "One moment." She disappeared through a door beside the host stand, and Claire stood in the entrance of Orem, feeling the weight of a dozen glances. The restaurant was full of people who dressed the way the room expected: silk blouses, tailored jackets, watches that cost more than her monthly rent. A couple near the window looked her way and then looked away. A man at the bar let his eyes linger a beat too long, not with interest, but with the particular curiosity reserved for things that seem out of place. Claire straightened her spine. She was not the kind of woman who made herself smaller. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom house in rural Pennsylvania, with parents who taught her that dignity was not something given to you by circumstances. It was something you carried. She had put herself through nursing school, buried her father, supported her mother through illness, and built a life that was, if not glamorous, deeply and genuinely hers. She could stand in a restaurant for 5 minutes without shrinking. The manager who appeared was a compact man in his 40s named Harold, whose suit was excellent and whose smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. He introduced himself, listened to Claire's explanation with theatrical patience, and then delivered the same verdict as Serena, wrapped in slightly more syllables. "Miss Whitmore, I do apologize for the confusion, but without a confirmed booking reflected in our system, we simply cannot seat guests, especially on a night when we are entirely at capacity. I hope you understand." "I do have the confirmation," she said again, keeping her voice level. "Third-party platforms sometimes generate confirmations that aren't transmitted to our internal system," Harold said, as though this were a known and established act of God. "I would encourage you to contact the booking platform directly for a refund." And then, this was the part Claire would replay in her mind for weeks. Harold glanced briefly, almost involuntarily, at her shoes. It was the smallest movement. He probably didn't even know he'd done it. But Claire saw it, and something inside her went very quiet. "I see," she said softly. Again, our sincere apologies for the inconvenience. He was already beginning to turn away. "Could I at least wait at the bar?" she asked, "in case something opens up?" Another pause. Harold's smile remained intact, but something shifted behind it. "Our bar is also fully reserved this evening, I'm afraid." It was, Claire noticed, not fully reserved. She could see at least 2 empty stools from where she stood. She nodded once, picked up her purse from where she'd rested it on the edge of the podium, and turned toward the door. She did not rush. She did not cry. She walked through the entrance of Orem the same way she'd walked in, with her chin level and her steps steady, and stepped out onto the sidewalk where the September air was cool and carried the smell of the city, exhaust and coffee, and something faintly sweet from a pretzel cart half a block down. She stood there for a moment, breathing. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She took it out and saw a message from a number she knew by heart. "Running about 20 minutes late. Traffic near the bridge. Don't order without me. I want the lamb. Love you." Claire read the message twice. Then she typed back, "Take your time. I'll be outside." She didn't say anything else. She leaned against the iron railing beside the restaurant's entrance, watching cabs and town cars drift past, and she thought about the way Harold had glanced at her shoes, and the way Serena had looked through her, and the quiet, practiced efficiency with which she had been made to feel like a mistake. She was still thinking about it when a black car pulled to the curb 17 minutes later. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with dark hair that was just beginning to show the first threads of grey at the temples. He wore a charcoal jacket over an open-collared shirt, no tie, and moved with the kind of unhurried confidence that has nothing to prove and everything earned. He saw Claire and his whole face changed, the slight tension of travel dissolving instantly into something much warmer. "Hey," he said, crossing the sidewalk to her. He cupped her face in both hands and kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry I'm late. How was the clinic tonight?" "Hard day," she said, "the usual kind." He pulled back just enough to look at her properly, the way he always did, like reading a page he knew by heart but still found worth reading. "You're outside," he said. "I am." "Did something happen?" Claire looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the polished doors of Orem, at the soft gold light spilling through the glass, at the silhouette of Serena moving behind the host stand. "They said my reservation wasn't in their system," she said quietly, "and then they asked me to leave." Daniel Whitmore was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, took out his own phone and made a call. The call lasted 4 minutes. Claire stood beside Daniel on the sidewalk, watching his face, which told her almost nothing, because Daniel Whitmore, when he was truly angry, went very still. Not loud, not sharp, not theatrical. Still. The way deep water goes still right before it pulls something under. She had seen that stillness only a handful of times in the 3 years they'd been married. Once when a contractor had deliberately overcharged the foundation they ran together in rural Pennsylvania. Once when a journalist had printed something cruel and false about her background to undermine a charity initiative she'd led. And once, early in their relationship, when a man at a gala had spoken to her in a way that Daniel had caught from across a room and crossed without hesitation. Each time the stillness had preceded something quiet and absolute. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Are you hungry?" he asked her. "Daniel? Because I know a place 3 blocks from here that does an incredible branzino we could walk." He offered his arm. "I want to know what you just did." "I made a call," he said simply. "Are you cold? You look cold." She was not cold. She was watching him with the particular attention she'd developed over years of knowing him, reading the slight tension around his jaw, the way his eyes had gone to the restaurant door for just a moment before settling back on her. "You're not going to tell me?" she asked. "I'll tell you over dinner." He tilted his head toward the street. "Branzino?" Claire studied him for another moment, and then, because she was tired and hungry, and because she had long ago learned that Daniel revealed things in his own time and always completely, She took his arm. They walked. Daniel Whitmore was not the kind of man who appeared in gossip columns or posed for magazine covers. He had been offered both, multiple times, and declined both consistently. He ran Whitmore Capital, a private investment group that had, over the past 2 decades, quietly accumulated holdings in real estate, hospitality, and infrastructure across the northeastern United States. His name appeared in financial publications. His face did not. He preferred it that way. Claire had met him not at a gala or a charity auction, or any of the places where wealthy men and interesting women were supposed to collide. She had met him at a rural clinic in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where she had been volunteering on weekends for 3 years, and where Daniel had arrived one Saturday morning, unannounced, no staff, no entourage, to see firsthand a community health initiative his foundation had funded. She had been in the middle of explaining a medication schedule to an elderly patient and had not noticed him come in. He had waited. That was the first thing she registered about him. Not his face or his clothes or the car she later learned he'd driven himself. It was the fact that he had stood quietly by the door for 11 minutes, without attempting to interrupt her, without checking his phone, without doing any of the things that people who considered their own time more important than others' time inevitably did. When she finally turned and saw him, she said professionally and without particular warmth, "Can I help you?" And he said, "I hope so. I'm trying to understand what this place actually needs. The reports I've been given are useful, but they're numbers. I'd rather talk to the people." She had liked him immediately and had not trusted that liking for several months. Because Claire had grown up watching what money did to people, not money itself, but the particular gravitational field of it, the way it bent behavior, softened accountability, made some people believe that their preferences were the natural shape of the world. She had seen enough to be careful. But Daniel was consistently, stubbornly different. He showed up to things alone. He asked questions and then listened to the full answers. He did not explain to her how the world worked. He did not diminish what she did by calling it noble or selfless. Words that always made Claire feel subtly patronized, as though caring for people were some kind of elevated hobby, rather than necessary work. He treated her knowledge as knowledge, her experience as expertise. And when he fell in love with her, which he did slowly and then, it seemed, all at once, he said so directly, without performance, on a Tuesday evening in October, when they were sitting on the porch of his family's old farmhouse in Pennsylvania, and she'd been telling him about a particularly hard week. He'd just looked at her in the middle of a sentence and said, "I think I love you, Claire. I've been trying to find a more sophisticated way to say it, but I can't." She had laughed. Then she'd cried a little. Then she'd said, "I think I love you too. It scares me." "Why?" "Because I've worked very hard to build a life that belongs to me." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to take it. I'm asking if I can be part of it." They were married 11 months later. Small ceremony, Pennsylvania farmhouse, her mother in the front row, no press. Over branzino and a glass of white wine she barely touched, Claire told him the whole story. The confirmation email, Serena's look, Harold's visit, the glance at her shoes. The empty bar stools she'd been told were reserved. Daniel listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass slowly in his hand. "You know what the worst part was?" Claire said. "It wasn't being turned away. I've been turned away from things before. It was the way he looked at my shoes." She paused. "Like, that was the information he needed. To decide whether you mattered." Daniel said, "Yes." He nodded slowly. "What would you like to happen?" She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that. What outcome would feel right to you?" Claire thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not performing consideration. "I don't want an apology from them. Apologies from people like that don't mean anything. They're just liability management." She looked down at her glass. "I think what bothers me most is that they'll do it again, to the next woman who walks in wearing the wrong shoes, and the one after that. And nothing will change." Daniel was quiet again. Then, "I did make that call earlier." "I know. I called Marcus Chen." Claire blinked. Marcus Chen was Daniel's chief of acquisitions, the person he contacted when he was interested in buying something. "Daniel, Aurum is actually a mid-size holding," he said, with the measured calm of a man discussing weather patterns. 3 locations, the Manhattan flagship, 1 in Boston, 1 in Chicago. The parent group has been looking for an exit for about 18 months. The flagship alone is struggling with debt service after their last renovation. He paused. Marcus had a file on them already, as it happens. Claire stared at him. "You called your acquisitions director," she said slowly, from the sidewalk. "I did. Because they turned me away." "Because," Daniel said carefully, "they turned you away based on what you were wearing and assumed that was all they needed to know about you. And because systems like that don't change unless someone changes them." He met her eyes. "And because I happen to have the ability to change them." Claire was quiet for a long moment. "How long would something like that take?" she asked, and something in her voice had shifted. Not quite the same person who'd leaned against that iron railing. "Faster than they'd expect," Daniel said. Outside the restaurant window, the city moved in its usual urgent blur. Somewhere across Manhattan, in a room full of marble and soft lighting and jazz, Harold was probably seating another couple, glancing at another pair of shoes, making another quiet calculation about who belonged and who didn't. He had no idea that calculation was already being reconsidered. The offer went in on a Thursday. Claire didn't ask about the details, not because she wasn't curious, but because she understood that Daniel's world operated on its own rhythm, and pressing it never made it move faster. She had learned early in their marriage that the way he worked was methodical and quiet, like water finding its way through stone. He didn't announce. He didn't posture. He simply moved and things changed. What she did know was that by Friday morning, Marcus Chen had submitted a letter of intent to the ownership group behind Aurum, a hospitality conglomerate called Hargrove & Voss that operated 11 restaurant properties across the Northeast, most of them bleeding money they refused to acknowledge publicly. The Manhattan flagship had been hemorrhaging quietly for 2 years, propped up by the Boston location's margins and a reputation that was, Marcus had noted in his briefing, more mythology than mathematics. Daniel had read the briefing at the kitchen table on Friday, while Claire drank coffee across from him, and the only thing he said when he finished was, "The bones are good." "The bones," Claire repeated. "The building, the kitchen infrastructure, the location." He set the folder down. "Everything else is fixable." She looked at him over the rim of her mug. "You're actually doing this." "I told you I was." "I know, but—" She set her mug down. "Daniel, this is a significant acquisition because of what happened to me one evening. That seems disproportionate," he offered. "I was going to say personal." "It is personal," he said without apology. "But it's also a sound investment. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive." He paused. "And for what it's worth, Marcus flagged 3 separate employment complaints filed against the Manhattan location in the past 14 months. 2 by staff, 1 by a guest, all involving the same management team." He looked at her steadily. "What happened to you wasn't an anomaly, Claire. It was a pattern." She absorbed that in silence. "What happens to Harold?" she asked finally. "That depends on what the due diligence shows." "And Serena?" "Same answer." Claire nodded slowly. She wasn't a vengeful person. She knew that about herself with certainty, had tested it enough times to trust it. What she wanted wasn't punishment. What she wanted was what she'd told Daniel in the restaurant 3 blocks away. She wanted it to stop happening, to the next woman with the wrong shoes and the one after that. What neither of them anticipated was the leak. It came on the following Tuesday, 9 days after the letter of intent had been submitted and 3 days before the due diligence period was scheduled to begin. Claire was at the clinic when her phone started buzzing with unusual frequency, a pattern she recognized as "something has happened" rather than ordinary notifications. She stepped into the hallway between patients and opened the screen. The headline on a financial news site read, "Whitmore capitalized luxury hospitality acquisition. Sources say personal slight triggered the move." She read the article with a sinking feeling that had nothing to do with the content and everything to do with the framing. The piece was not wrong exactly, but it was told in a way that made Daniel look impulsive, retaliatory. A billionaire throwing a corporate tantrum because his wife had been inconvenienced. It made Claire sound like a prop, and it contained details that could only have come from inside the negotiation. The timeline, the specific properties named, the reference to Hargrove and Voss. Someone had talked. By the time she reached Daniel that evening, he had already identified the source with the help of his legal team. It was not, as it turned out, anyone from Whitmore Capital. It was Harold. Not the manager himself, but through him. He had apparently spoken to a cousin who worked in financial media, and that conversation had become the article. Whether it was intentional sabotage or simple indiscretion, the result was the same. The acquisition was now public, the framing was damaging, and Hargrove and Voss had gone suddenly and conspicuously silent. "They're spooked," Marcus told Daniel on a call that Claire sat beside him for, perched on the edge of his home office desk. "The publicity has made them nervous. There's a counter-narrative forming, some hospitality industry voices saying Whitmore is overreaching, that this is about ego, not investment." "It's not about ego," Daniel said. "I know that. You know that. But perception is manageable," Daniel said. "What's their actual position? Do they want to sell or not? Their lawyer called this morning. They're requesting a pause on the process. 2 weeks." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Tell them we respect their timeline, and tell them we'll be sending a revised offer sheet during that window." Marcus paused. "Revised how?" "Better," Daniel said simply and ended the call. Claire looked at him. "You're going to offer them more?" "After the leak." "The leak came from their building, not from them. And honestly," he leaned back in his chair, "I think they're not sure we're serious. They've seen the article. They think this is theater." A slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "I'd like to show them it isn't." The 2 weeks that followed were for Claire strange in the way that waiting always was. She went to the clinic. She cooked. She ran 3 mornings a week in Central Park the way she always had, early enough that the paths were still quiet and the light came in low and gold through the trees. She called her mother in Pennsylvania, who knew nothing about any of it, and talked for 40 minutes about the neighbor's new dog. But she also, she admitted to herself, thought about Orem. Not with anger. That had faded quickly, as her angers always did. But with a kind of persistent curiosity she couldn't quite put down. She found herself thinking about the staff who worked there, the kitchen team, the servers who had nothing to do with what Harold and Serena had decided. She thought about the jazz quartet she'd heard playing in the back and wondered if they were independent contractors or on a hospitality payroll, and whether any of this would affect them. She brought it up to Daniel one evening. "The employees," she said. "If this goes through, what happens to them?" He looked up from what he was reading. "What do you mean?" "The people who work there, the servers, the kitchen, the musicians." She paused. "I don't want anyone losing a job because of what happened to me." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I wouldn't have it any other way." "I want that explicit," she said, "not just implied." He nodded once, the particular nod that meant "I hear you and it will be done. Marcus will build it into the transition terms." "Thank you." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know, most people in your position would be focused on the outcome for the people who turned them away." "I know," she said, "but those people are a problem to be solved. The people in the kitchen didn't do anything to me." He smiled. Not the polished, public-facing version, but the real one, the one she'd fallen in love with, quiet and a little crooked. "This is why," he said. "Why what? Why I called Marcus from that sidewalk." He set down what he was reading. "Because you were standing there with your confirmation email and your perfectly good reservation, and they looked at your shoes and decided that was sufficient. And you held your head up and walked out without saying a single cruel thing." He paused. "You didn't need me to defend you, but I wanted to." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, from across the room, her phone buzzed. She reached for it and saw a message from Marcus Chen. "Hargrove and Voss accepted the revised offer, signing scheduled for Friday. Thought you'd want to know tonight." She read it once, then handed the phone to Daniel without a word. He read it, set the phone down, looked at her. Outside the window, Manhattan was doing what it always did, moving, glittering, indifferent, and magnificent at once. Somewhere across town, in a restaurant full of marble and soft light, a manager named Harold was finishing his Tuesday shift with no idea that the building around him had just changed hands. Friday was 4 days away. The signing happened on a Friday morning in a conference room on the 34th floor of a midtown building, with lawyers on both sides and a view of the city that made everything below look very small and very manageable. Claire was not present for the signing. That was Daniel's world, not hers, and she had never felt the need to occupy spaces simply because she could. She was at the clinic. It was, she had decided, exactly where she wanted to be when it happened. She found out it was done through a text from Marcus at 11:14 in the morning. 3 words, "Keys are yours." She read it between patients, standing in the same hallway where she'd read the news article 2 weeks earlier, and she felt something settle in her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter than both of those things. She typed back, "Thank you, Marcus." Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. Daniel gave her no details about what happened next at Orem, not because he was keeping things from her, but because he was methodical, and he didn't report on process, only outcomes. What she knew was that he had installed an interim general manager named Patricia Owens, a woman with 20 years in hospitality management who had, according to Marcus, a reputation for being both exacting and deeply fair. Patricia had been briefed on the full situation, not just the business metrics, but the specific circumstances that had initiated the acquisition. She had reportedly said, "Good. I've seen this kind of place before. I know exactly what needs fixing." Harold was let go within the first week of the transition, not dramatically, not publicly, but cleanly and with the severance his contract entitled him to, no more and no less. Serena was placed on a formal performance review with specific and documented standards. The booking system, which an audit revealed had in fact correctly recorded Claire's reservation before it was apparently deleted from the active queue, was overhauled entirely with a new management interface and oversight protocols. The jazz quartet, independent contractors as Claire had suspected, were offered extended bookings through the following spring. Every member of the kitchen staff was retained. Claire learned all of this gradually, over the course of 2 weeks, in the easy way she and Daniel had always shared information, over coffee, over dinner, in the 20 minutes before sleep when the day was still being processed and the room was dark and quiet. "Patricia wants to do a soft relaunch," Daniel told her one evening. "New reservation system, adjusted front-of-house protocols, some menu changes. She's calling it a refinement, not a rebrand. She thinks keeping the Orem name has value." "It does," Claire said. "The restaurant isn't the problem. The people running it were the problem." Daniel nodded. "She asked about you, actually." Claire looked up. "Patricia." "She asked if you'd be willing to consult on the charitable component." Claire set down her glass. "The what?" "Patricia's proposal includes partnering with a local organization. She wants to reserve a dining experience each month for people who couldn't otherwise access it. Community health workers, teachers, first responders. A proper dinner, the full menu, no ceremony about it." He paused. "She wanted to know if you'd help design the outreach side of it." Claire was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the evening she had stood outside that restaurant with a confirmation email on a cracked phone screen and the specific, efficient way she'd been made to feel invisible. She thought about the weight of that, not just the personal sting of it, but what it represented, the quiet systems that told people where they belonged before they'd had a chance to open their mouths. "Yes," she said. "I'll talk to her." The soft relaunch of Orem happened on a Wednesday evening, 6 weeks after the acquisition was finalized. Daniel had suggested they go. Claire had agreed with one condition. "We go as ourselves," she said. "No announcement, no reservation under a different name, no security. We walk in the same way I walked in the first time." He had looked at her with something that might have been amusement and something that was definitely admiration. Exactly the same way? Exactly. So that was what they did. Claire wore the same pale blue dress. She had considered wearing something else, something that would read as a statement, a declaration. But in the end, She came back to the pale blue. Because she refused to let a dress be the lesson. The dress was fine. The dress had always been fine. The problem had never been the dress. She wore her mother's purse. They took a cab. The entrance to Orem looked the same from the outside, the same warm light through the glass, the same quiet elegance of the awning and the polished handles on the doors. But when they stepped inside, something was different in ways that were hard to name precisely and felt important exactly because of that. The host stand was staffed by a young man named Oliver, mid-20s, warm-eyed, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been trained to make people feel expected rather than evaluated. He looked up when they came in and smiled with the entirety of his face. "Good evening," he said. "Welcome to Orem. Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "We do," Claire said. "Whitmore, party of 2. Oliver checked the screen, found them immediately, and nodded with the ease of someone for whom this is the entire point of his role. "Of course. Your table is ready. Follow me, please." He led them through the restaurant, which was full and warm and smelled exactly as it had the first time, truffle and wine, and something low and beautiful from the jazz quartet near the back. The marble floors still caught the light. The room was still beautiful, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. Something in the way the staff moved, the way Oliver had checked the screen without hesitation, the way a server across the room caught Claire's eye as she passed and nodded pleasantly, as though her presence were the most natural thing in the world, because it was. They were seated at a corner table with a view of the room. A different server came, a woman named Joy who had been with the restaurant for 4 years and whose demeanor was warm without being performative. She walked them through the menu with the ease of someone who genuinely loved the food she was describing. When she left to give them a moment, Claire looked around the room. She looked at the other tables, couples and colleagues and friends, people in expensive jackets and people in department store dresses. A young woman near the window in paint-stained sneakers who was laughing at something her companion had said. Claire noticed her specifically, the paint-stained sneakers, and the fact that no one was looking at them. She felt something release in her chest. Daniel was watching her face. He always watched her face. "Okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hands were warm, familiar, the hands of someone she had chosen carefully and well. "I want the lamb," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, the unguarded kind, and it surprised her a little, the ease of it, the way it arrived without effort. "You always want the lamb," she said, "because the lamb is always the right choice." She shook her head, smiling, and looked down at the menu. The jazz quartet shifted into something slow and unhurried, a melody that moved through the room like a hand smoothing fabric. And for a long moment Claire simply sat with it, the warmth of the room and the weight of Daniel's hand over hers, and the strange, complete feeling of arriving somewhere she'd already been, and finding it entirely different. Later, after the lamb and a piece of chocolate tart she hadn't planned on ordering, and 2 glasses of a white wine that Joy had recommended without being asked, Patricia Owens appeared at their table. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who has seen every version of a room and is not impressed by any of them except the one that actually works. She shook Daniel's hand and then turned to Claire and looked at her directly, the way people rarely did. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I'm glad you came back." "So am I," Claire said. Patricia sat with them for a few minutes, and they talked about the outreach program, the logistics of it, the organizations Claire had already been in contact with through the clinic, the quiet, practical shape of what it could become. Not a publicity initiative, not a feel-good press release, just a standing reservation every month for people who had spent their days giving and rarely got to receive. When Patricia left, Daniel refilled Claire's wineglass and looked at her across the table. "You know," he said, "you never told me what you would have done if I hadn't called Marcus that night." Claire considered the question. Outside the restaurant's tall windows, Manhattan moved in its perpetual restless way, headlights and pedestrians, and the long-lit corridors of buildings stretching up into a sky made amber by the city's own light. "I would have gone home," she said. "I would have been angry for a few days, and then I would have let it go." She paused. That's what you do. You absorb the thing and you move on, because the alternative is letting it take something from you. And now? He asked. She looked around the room one more time, at Joy refilling water at a nearby table, at Oliver welcoming another couple at the entrance with that same open, unhurried smile, at the woman with the paint-stained sneakers who was now studying the dessert menu with great seriousness. Now, Claire said, something actually changed. She picked up her wineglass. That's better than letting it go, she said. That's fixing it. Daniel raised his glass to meet hers. The jazz quartet played on, low and warm and steady, filling every corner of the room with something that felt, if you were paying attention, very much like belonging.